The tale begins at a modest home in Southern California. Our dreamer, let's call him Larry, busily packs up the supplies he thinks he'll need to make a flight hanging from a bunch of weather balloons he bought at an Army surplus store. His girlfriend thinks he's nuts and tries to talk him out of it.
I am going. Face it.
He plans to make this trip in nothing more formidable than a simple lawn chair. He and his buddies secure the chair with a rope, which Larry will cut when he's ready to lift off, while his girlfriend videotapes this pack of lunatics with an old camera.
It'll be fine, Carol. Don't worry.
Larry's pals secure a rope to the bumper of his truck, while Larry himself inflates the balloons with helium. Once inflated, he rigs them all together. With all the preparations made, Larry climbs aboard his makeshift contraption, making sure everything is comfy and secure. Sitting firmly in his open-air cockpit, he readies himself for the launch.
It's a little rip.
Let her go!
The rope is cut, and suddenly, Larry is airborne. In no time, he's floating far above the rooftops of his neighborhood, delighted that his one-man flying machine is actually taking him for a ride. Neighbors look on, astonished by the bizarre sight of a man in a lawn chair, soaring ever upwards. He begins to climb thousands of feet into the air, higher than he ever thought possible. Even a passing airplane pilot spots him rising into commercial airspace. But as he continues to climb, the air starts getting cold, and Larry starts getting scared. He soars far higher than he anticipated. So, he pulls out his BB gun and pops a balloon to stop his climb. But while grappling with his equipment, he accidentally drops the gun, and it plummets to the earth. Then he begins to descend, but a little too quickly. So he slashes the water bottles he brought for ballast. Ultimately, he lands on a neighbor's rooftop, a few miles away. This comical story has been around since 1982. But did it really happen? Could it even happen? Well, the reality is that the business of lighter-than-air travel is a lot more complicated than blowing up balloons. About the only way to check out the real difficulties of lighter-than-air travel these days is to take a ride aboard the world-famous Goodyear blimp.
What's going on now is the crew is putting up the mast, and they're going to raise the pole so the blimp will have some place to moor during the night. The pole will be about 35 feet high. It'll have 12 cables to hold it in place. The blimp will come on board and moor right on the tip of it. In between flights, we need a crew of 13 minimum. We usually use 15 people. It takes one man to direct the traffic on the ground, 6 people in the car, anywhere from 6 to 8 people on the nose lines.
An airship is actually the hardest aircraft I've ever learned how to fly. It's filled with helium, and that gives you your lift. Then it has 2 engines that moves you through the sky. Then you have an elevator and rudder for steering it, almost like a boat. It handles more like a sub than it does actually an airplane. The airship flies up around about 1,500 feet, 2,000 feet. Most of your general aviation, they'll be flying like 3,000 to 5,000 feet.
This means that Larry, at his maximum height of 16,000 feet, was soaring far above pretty much everything but commercial aircraft. Our story is sounding less and less credible. On the other hand, the National Weather Service launches hydrogen-filled balloons twice a day, every day. And these balloons can achieve altitudes of 100,000 feet, 20 miles. They carry a payload of instruments to collect such data as air temperature, pressure, humidity, and wind. And sometimes they can blow miles off course. But does any of this mean that Larry's fanciful flight actually took place?
On July 2nd, 1982, Larry Walters took off in his lawn chair attached to 41 helium weather balloons from his girlfriend's mother's house in San Pedro, shot up to 16,000 feet, and crash landed about an hour and a half later in Long Beach. Well, between 1962 and 1982, Larry was obsessed with sightseeing across the country using weather balloons.
He worked as a production assistant for a film company. Steve Gottlieb, a film editor, was a friend of Larry's and took these photographs the day Larry made his historic trip on the balloon chair he dubbed Inspiration.
Larry's personality is hard to describe. He was, I worked with him as well as being a friend of his. He had some quirks that were a little hard to comprehend at times, but he was an all-around nice guy.
And he was very serious about the trip he wanted to make.
Larry made a lot of preparations before the flight. He studied the jet stream. He knew he could make it at least to the Rockies, hopefully to the Mississippi in 3 to 5 days.
But the adventure was ill-fated from the start.
First of all, it was an accidental launch. He wasn't supposed to launch at that time, so nothing was secured to the lawn chair.
Even so, Larry told Steve that he enjoyed the early part of his offbeat adventure.
Everything was very peaceful. It was just the brush of the wind, which there was very little of. He was not too awful concerned about himself. It was a casual flight, so to speak. As casual as that can be, I don't know.
But it wasn't long before Larry casually ascended to 16,000 feet, and at that point, he began to drift into danger.
He was between the flight path of Long Beach Airport and LAX. I know he was spotted by 2 airline pilots.
Melvin Davis describes the reaction of Los Angeles Air Traffic Control.
So the second airplane comes by, reports the sighting of a group of balloons, and then quite warily after that says it appears that there's a man attached to the balloons. So we take that report somewhat tongue-in-cheek and tell the next aircraft that comes out as he passes over the Los Angeles airport, there's a group of balloons off to your right, and I believe the altitude at the time was somewhere around 13,500 feet. And oh, by the way, there may or may not be a man attached to it. And so the second airplane comes out and sure enough reports that yes, those are balloons and yes, there is a man attached to it.
After Larry reached over 10,000 feet, he decided to start shooting out some of the balloons with his BB pistol. Right after that, he set the gun on his lap. Gust of wind came along, and there went the gun. After he reached 16,000 feet, he was ready to bail out.
Shooting out the balloons caused Larry to descend. As he came down, Steve Gottlieb followed him in his car.
We kept him in sight, saw where he was coming down, used the streets to get to him, and we were able to get to him like about 30 seconds after he landed. It wasn't a crash or anything. The balloons got hung up in the power lines behind a house in a residential area of Long Beach, and there he was.
Larry was incredibly lucky, and he later said he'd never do it again. He passed away in 1993, but his story survives because of its inspirational lunacy.
I think, particularly within an American context, our sense of nationality involves people setting out on frontiers, going beyond the norm. There's a cultural expectation that people trying to make discoveries will do sometimes just absurd and crazy things.
He had a childhood dream, but we all have dreams. Larry's dream was to sightsee across the country. As many of us sat in our lawn chairs and fantasized and dreamed, Larry chose to fly in his lawn chair.
Larry Walters' journey into the wild blue yonder offered some shocking surprises. But perhaps not nearly as shocking as the surprise awaiting a traveling couple one night at dinner.